Hello friends and welcome back. This is going to be the third video in our series about narcissism in astrology, where we're exploring how this complex and often misunderstood personality structure can be interpreted through the symbolic language of astrology. In this third episode, we're going to focus on our lovely Venus, specifically how the narcissist false self comes to co-opt and again hijack this planet also, as we saw with Mercury, when it comes to cooperation, connection, love, and beauty, where it turns all of these functions of Venus towards its own self-illusions, control, and all for the maintenance of the false self, which is the self-concept of the narcissist. And just to do a quick recap, in the first episode, which was about the sun and the moon, I spent some time unpacking what narcissism actually is. And I took some time to go beyond just the pop psychology that we have online, especially for astrology, if we're trying to understand what symbols connect to what. And when we're talking about complex disorders such as narcissism, we have to start to understand, well, how do we generally define this disorder? So I spent quite a bit of time putting this disorder into the context of its theories, which I feel that is very important if we want to become apt at understanding it in a chart. And in that first video, we looked at the sun and the moon, where I was showing how this concept of the false self, which is at the core of narcissism, is related to the sun, and how the sun becomes that way, which is related to the moon, which is that mother archetype, and those initial conditions of life where we are nurtured. Then in the second video, we turned to Mercury, which is a planet representing the intellect, communication, cognition, relationships. And we saw how the narcissist uses its speech acts, its thinking process, and its perception to have a sense of control over its environment. We saw the dexterity of the mind, let's say, in the narcissist in terms of manipulating different situations through the Mercury function. And again, in that video, we saw how the narcissist mind, that false self, comes to hijack Mercury to bring it to its own service, to maintain its own internal fantasies, because the false self in itself is a kind of a fantasy. And if you haven't watched those first two videos, I highly encourage you to do it. There's a playlist on the channel, Narcissism in Astrology, so you don't have to plow through different kinds of videos to be able to find it. Because in those previous two videos, I laid the foundations of what is this disorder about. And as we'll see, every planet comes to co-conspire in this personality disorder. It's not like we can only point to one planet and say, that's it. As we can see systematically, they're all one after another coming in. And Venus is not an exemption. The nodes will not be an exemption, even the outer planets, because we'll talk about all of them. In this video specifically, we're going to look at how the narcissist relates, because we're looking at Venus, how they form bonds, how they choose their partners, and what it is that they truly desire in relationships. What are they looking for? Especially, we have to ask this question, because if it's not the true self looking for a relationship, and it's the false self on the driver's seat looking for a relationship, well, what is this false self looking for? And how does it obtain this? And just to give you a heads up, in the narcissist chart, Venus becomes very dysfunctional. Love is very much distorted, is very much transactional, it's ornamental, and in many cases is dangerous. To actually be honest with you, this was the most dreaded video of the series that I knew from the get-go that this would be the most dreaded one to record, because it's heartbreaking. If you've been on the other end of it, you've been the love partner of a narcissist, it qualifies as a tragic story. And I've been there, so I understand the feeling, and I didn't really want to evoke those feelings, and they were being evoked when I was writing it. And saying that right now, if any of you have just gotten out of a relationship with a narcissist and you're still processing and it's a hot mess when you do, if you find that this video is triggering, or if it's taking your mind to places that's not pleasant, press stop watching and come back to it whenever you're ready. Because I was saying that in the first video, the kind of impression and imprint that they leave behind, the chaos and the mess, it takes a while to sort it. And I actually don't feel the interjection of other people's voice in that process is always helpful. So keep that in mind. I do want to make that disclaimer. And I do want to make another disclaimer. I've been doing it in all the videos. And because this has become such a prominent topic, as if like 50% of the population are narcissists and we should be so aware of them, it's like 3 to 6% max of the population who are diagnosed with narcissism. And it actually requires a clinician to understand what this disorder is in that category of personality disorders, which is the cluster B, which also includes borderline and psychopathy. You need a professional to understand what traits are consistent, and then they can diagnose the person. And we should also not be doing self-diagnosis, because when life crises comes up, we don't have a good mind in that moment. We are not centered. We are not operating from the seat of our own being. So we make decisions that are very close to narcissism, but they call that narcissistic style. So maybe you're going through a hardship in life and you're like, oh my God, I'm like these traits. Don't self-diagnose, don't diagnose other people. These videos are a way for us to understand the phenomena of the world, cultural aspects, psychological. They're supposed to have a representation in astrology. Astrology is supposed to tell us how the world functions. And if narcissism is a phenomenon in the world, then astrology should have symbolism that can depict this, that can describe this. So our point is actually to understand the symbols while understanding what narcissism is so that we can recognize the symbols. So I do want to make that disclaimer of not diagnosing other people and not diagnosing ourselves. And of course, one last thing is a matter of housekeeping. I love having you guys here. If you like me on your phone, on your TV, wherever that you're watching, and you like the content of this video, the series, the channel, please do like, subscribe, and comment. That helps me a lot to continue going. It's hard to be a full-time astrologer. So as this thing picks up and there's more momentum, then I can bring more of my life to this side and dedicate more time and energy to it, which I love. And you guys know I love communicating with you. Being an astrologer is a lonely path a lot of times because a lot of people don't speak this language. So when we can speak, I highly appreciate it. And again, I want to emphasize, when you've been in a relationship with a narcissist, it's very likely that you're experiencing PTSD. So if this video starts to stir things up, stop it. There's other times you can come back to it. Now let's get on to Venus and Venus's function in narcissistic personality disorder. So let's look at something that Venus, when functional, at its core, what does it represent? Represents receptivity, is of the feminine principle. So it's about taking in, like the moon, empathy, care. Venus also has these qualities. Venus is also about cooperation. It's about Mercury. In the last video, I talked a lot about Mercury too. It brings things into relation. So it creates that nexus and that initial connection. Venus now starts the merging process, and it merges different components. So the two can become one. And we can say love has that feeling. I won't describe that's what love is, but love has that feeling. So Venus is the ultimate connector. Venus also represents our five senses, so it becomes related to sensual pleasures. Venus's motion type is attractive, and because of that receptive quality that it has, it can even be passive, and it can magnetize, attract people to itself or things to itself. And like Mercury, Venus is also a very relational planet. So whenever we're in a relational dynamic to other human beings, we're either talking about the function of Mercury, and if it's very close and intimate, we're talking about Venus. Venus creates possibility of union. And in our human realm, in order to establish that connection and to have a union, it always requires mutual recognition, and it requires us to have certain degree of shared values. But in narcissism, this Venetian function and everything that it symbolizes is distorted. For the narcissist, instead of Venus being a genuine mode of connection and establishing connection, Venus is turned inwards and it's absorbed by the narcissist's false self. Rather than making itself open and vulnerable, available to another person, Venus is used to create a self-focused illusion where it places itself at the center and it expects to be seen, admired, acknowledged, validated, and praised. In fact, the narcissist uses the Venus function to convey how special it is. And Venus is very much related to the fantasy of the narcissist. And as I was explaining in the other videos, the false self itself is a kind of a fantasy because the narcissist doesn't operate from an authentic center and core. The core identity and the self, which is the false self, is a fantastical self-construction, which is an idealized version of the self. And this fantasy of the false self is a way of the narcissist seeing themselves as something or someone that's flawless, always in control, always winning. It's a very prominent and favorite word or way of being in the world, the winner, winning, and they are never wrong. So the false self just has these core features. And the narcissist lives in this fantasy, and it lives in this fantasy to escape reality at all times. For the narcissist, reality is full of pain and vulnerability, which is unbearable because it's going to show it its flaws. It's going to show it how it's not in control. Which one of us is fully in control? Even having control is a mere illusion. And we know that, and we negotiate with it. For a narcissist, that's unbearable. So Venus in this kind of a setup becomes a psychic decorator of the narcissist's internal world and its own sense of self. It wraps the false self in the illusions of beauty, attractiveness, charm, seduction, and this unbelievable imagined sense of self-worth. But with the narcissist, all of these facets are skin deep. Because when we think about beauty, for example, yes, something may be adorned, but that adornment is an expression of care. And its superficial version, we're just trying to create a perception to attract other people to ourselves. And for the narcissist, beauty and all the Venetian qualities are very skin deep. It's not an expression of its own authentic presence. It's a fantasy, it's an illusion. It's a projected illusion. In essence, Venus's function in the narcissist is disconnected from real people and real life experiences. Venus is not there to help the narcissist connect with other people. Venus is there with the false self constantly asking it, what can you do for me so that I remain connected to my fantasies, so that I stay intact? Me, the false self, I need to live. What can you do for me? Now, let's just take a very brief moment. It's worth to talk about this fantasy and how it originates. And I was saying in the first video for the sun and the moon, the narcissist is constantly looking for substitute mothers. So the partner of a narcissist is very much related to this, but we have to understand where this fantasy comes from and how all of these dots are connected to each other. So rewinding to the narcissist's childhood, to the stage of infancy, whenever the narcissist had an emotional expression, it was not received. It wasn't mirrored, it was not protected, and none of its self-expressions were accepted. In other words, the child was rejected. Its true and authentic self was not received by anyone. So what does the child do as a defense mechanism? Because you feel like you're being annihilated. You don't even have a sense of self. All you have are these expressions of how you feel internally, and the external world is not validating it. So the way to defend against this, from infancy, the person starts to construct an idealized version of themselves. And in that idealized version, they are lovable, they're good, they're loved. And because this is continuous, it gets entrenched into the person. And over time, this internal image of self-perfection becomes more real than reality itself. I mean, they've had practice. If you're a narcissist who's 30, 40, 50, even 20, you've had 20 years of practice of doing this. So it's very much entrenched and it becomes something real. And they say that by age 2, from infancy, by the age of 2, with just 2 years of practice, the fantasy self becomes the basis for the person's identity. So the deal is sealed because it's day in and day out of that kind of a performance. Now, because this is not entrenched in reality, that which is real in life can withstand stress test of life. Fantasies don't. That's why they're a fantasy. They just, a little bit of reality interjects and the whole thing falls apart. And in the narcissist, that true self has atrophied. It's small, it's little, it's fragile and vulnerable. And the false self is huge, but it's just inflation of something. It doesn't have substance. So the false self is vulnerable too. And this is the reason why they say narcissists need supply, which is admiration, validation, praise, telling them they're the greatest, they're the best, is because other people have to reflect the self-fantasy of the narcissist back to them. And any threat to this fantasy, any inconsistency, criticism, or vulnerability feels like annihilation. And it is a kind of annihilation, because if the false self is not there and the true self is dismal and atrophied and is not present anymore, who's there? It's a kind of a death for the narcissist. And narcissists will fight this to the death. Like if you are going to challenge their fantasy self, which is the false self, they will go to war with you. And we'll talk about that when we get to Mars. And they call that narcissistic rage, right? But we'll get to that. But the narcissist must protect this fantasy. And everything in its life is built around maintaining this fantasy, which is itself, through that false self. And just to briefly state what the function of the false self is, false self regulates the internal world of the narcissist. It protects against shame, inadequacy, and vulnerability, as well as rejection. It provides the narcissist a fictional sense of coherence, and that narrative is always configured around some sense of superiority, worth, some sort of an aggrandized version of itself. It maintains that image for the narcissist. And what this false self will do, this is where it comes to Venus and the relationship part. It is always replacing real and mutual relationship with idealized ones. So the false self makes sure that the narcissist never feels vulnerable in a relationship. It does not have to take that risk when it comes to true intimacy. Because as I mentioned, it cannot be criticized, there can be no inconsistencies. And we know when we fall in love with other people, as beautiful as love is, we get to see the ugliest part of ourselves because of the way other people mirror and reflect certain qualities that we have within that we are not at liberty to see it until we are in a relationship. The narcissist cannot stand this. So as we can see, narcissism has a lot to do with control when it comes to relationships. And the way for a narcissist to get into a relationship with you and to feel safe, they have to idealize you. And idealization in itself, as we can see, is a coping mechanism, which allows the narcissist to establish connection for extracting supply, and at the same time maintain all of its illusions without feeling jeopardized. So here, Venus, instead of establishing genuine connections, gets hijacked by the false self, and the entire purpose of life becomes just this circular feedback loop of the false self to the false self in order to get validation, praise, and at the same time, this idealization process also creates like a clause in the contract of the narcissist, which is to have an emotional escape. If those criticism and discrepancies come in, there's a way out. And another thing to remember, the narcissist is not using or engaging with the Venus archetype to fall in love. Venus is used as a way for the narcissist to love its own fantasy, which is the false self, which means to love itself, but it's actually not love. If we think about it, I don't want to diverge too much because this video is already going to be a bit longer, but it's just that they just need to be in love with that world of their own making with the false self at the middle of it. And others are merely used as a supply to feed this fantasy and the false self. So now let's go to the first phase of what it means to be loved and to be noticed by a narcissist, which here I'm calling scanning and selection, where Venus is at the service of the false self. First of all, the narcissist is always scanning whatever that's around it, not for real people, but for ideal projections, meaning they look for people who they can use to amplify the self-fantasy that they have. Like normally, Venus helps us recognize beauty, values that we share with other people, how other people resonate with us, how we might resonate with them. But for the narcissist, all of these are just transactional tools. What the narcissist cares about is not how beautiful you are, but based on how beautiful you are, how will that augment them in terms of how they will be seen? They want to merge with other people, not to merge with them for the sake of connection, but it's a question of how do they enhance me? In other words, the object of the narcissist's desire comes to be an extension of itself. And it's very important to remember that narcissists have problems with object relation. And the object relation theory, human beings are also called objects, like objects of the world. And different objects of the world are always in relation with each other. So me as an object of the world will be like, this is me. I'm separate and different than you because you're another object of the world. And then I start interacting with you based on that. But narcissists can't do this. They can't see other people as separate than themselves, as something distinct with their own autonomy and individuality. Like they have a hard time recognizing you as someone who has your own will, your own perspective, or your own inner life that's not about them, because everything's about them. That's part of the fantasy and the illusion. And part of that narcissistic fantasy is in general collapsing that boundary that exists between people. This is one of the reasons why they are so intrusive. And I was talking about identity theft in the Mercury video. This has a lot to do with it. Like, let's say you walk in, you have your own sense of beauty, personality, strengths, virtues. You just have your own light. But the narcissist doesn't see those as your attributes. They're merely things to be absorbed by the narcissist. And I discussed this, that chameleon quality of the narcissist, when I was discussing the Mercury video. I encourage you to watch that to understand this process. So in other words, you have to become an extension, a reflection, or merely a supporting actor in the story of the narcissist's greatness. That's what you're there for. In other words, the narcissist is looking for someone who has certain traits that they want to claim as their own. For example, someone who's attractive, someone who's soulful, someone who's strong again, someone who's admired. They've done the work, they've contributed to something, and other people admire them. And for the narcissist, this is the pre-projection phase, which means the person's not seen as they are. They are merely a potential mirror for the false self. In a sense, Venus is becoming commodified here. We're not talking about love for love's sake anymore, but it's a game of what can I gain from you based on the assets and the things that you have. For example, the narcissist's false self will think to itself, and it's unconscious. It's not like the narcissist is doing this consciously, but unconsciously, the false self is saying to itself, if I can attach myself to this person, I become special because there's something special about them. I can become more valuable. I can become even more real in the world. So as we can see, that superficial aspect of Venus is coming through when it's dysfunctional, when Venus is dysfunctional. Because Venus is not about love here. It's not about connection. It's about creating an image. It's about what they can extract from it. And from here on, love becomes a kind of a performance. And as we saw in the last two videos, the narcissist is all about performance. In fact, that's what the false self does. It just performs itself rather than live itself and be itself. And the performance is always to extract some sort of a resource from you. That's supply, which is validation, confirming that the false self is real, that it exists. Another way we can look at this is that the narcissist is not looking for love, is transactional, is commodifying love. So in essence, what the narcissist is looking for is a service provider, which is people who can feed the fantasy of the narcissist, people who can maintain its illusions of itself, people who can offer a steady supply of admiration, attention, or status to them. In other words, a stream of narcissistic supply. And you will hear this a lot from narcissists. They're not looking for a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They're looking for a personal assistant who will aid them in achieving their goals. And as we'll see, the kind of fantasies that they will construct and the way that they will project this so that you become that person is insane. We're getting into it. So a person's not loved for who they are. They're loved for what they symbolize. And if you think about it, the whole construct of a fantasy, when you think about it, we're talking about a set of symbols. And does this person symbolize what the narcissist needs? And can they provide that for the narcissist? If you are that candidate, you're in. You got the job. The narcissist's love object is not a person. It's just a token. It's a prop, a vessel that the narcissist just needs to fill with their projection. And this is key. I'm not saying this in passing, because what's being loved here is not the person, but a projection of perfection that the narcissist temporarily, and I'm going to emphasize the word temporarily, project to their object of desire. Let me just explain this a little bit further because it can be a little confusing and it's freaking strange. So bear with me for a second. So once the narcissist, let me explain it like this. Once the narcissist has selected their ideal candidate, the next step is projection. So first they were scanning, like who can project and who can be an extension of me and who can make me look better, who can be the greatest supply and the greatest service provider. So they chose the person. Now they have to start projecting things. And as soon as this projection process starts, the actual person disappears from the mind of the narcissist. Like the narcissist can't see them anymore. And as I explained, they're not looking at you, they're looking at what you can provide them. What they start to see is a mere reflection, which is an image that fits inside of their internal fantasies. So you will just become something like a screen, like a canvas, a blank canvas, where the narcissist will start to project its ideals of beauty, strength, perfection, superiority, anything that it thinks that it's valuing, it will paint it on top of that canvas as you. As we can see, Venus is playing a central role here because Venus is not here attracting anyone. It just becomes a mirror of the narcissist idealization, all that superficial things. So the partner in front of the narcissist is no longer a real individual. They don't have their own needs. They don't have their own complexities. They actually just become the crown jewel of the narcissist's false self, a beautiful extension of themselves. They are the king. She or he is merely the crown that they're now wearing, accentuating their feelings of kingliness. So the object of their desire, their partner, is merely a symbolic possession. So the love that the narcissist claims to be feeling is not relational, is ornamental, is not about building trust, intimacy, mutual growth. It's just about surrounding the self with beautiful objects. And the person that they're with could be one of those objects, which is affirming the illusion of the narcissist's perfection. This is the aestheticization of love when it comes to Venus's archetype. Like here, Venus is not the glue that binds people or allows them to merge with each other. It's about polishing things. It's about polishing things to make the narcissist look brighter and shinier. And you know, narcissists have a tendency to do this. When they get into a relationship with you, they can start to want to change your image a little bit to make you shinier into what they want you to make. They'll encourage you to like go become an actor, of course, da, da, da. Whatever that works for them, whatever that idealization is, that idealized way that they need in a partner, they will also encourage it. I mean, if they're really lucky, they'll find them that way, then they don't have to do the work. But if a little bit of work is required at the beginning, they will do that. And the person will actually think, oh my God, this person's so encouraging. They're so about me. But this is what's behind it. And this is where the tragedy actually begins. Because the partner initially feels like, oh my God, I'm so deeply valued. What I like is so valued. What I am like is so valued. But in actuality, they're not being seen at all. They're only going to be loved so long as they can mirror back the narcissist's self-fantasy. The moment that the person starts to reveal themselves as a human being, where we are all flawed, or they indicate a little bit of deviation from the fantasy, the illusion begins to crack, and it's not subtle. And we'll discuss this shortly. So now the question becomes, what happens after the projection? So we had the idealization, we had scanning, we had what happens next? What's the next step? And if you have dealt with narcissists, it's methodical. Like these steps, they do not deviate from it. There might be some back and forth where, you know, they're scanning, they're projecting, and then they retract back to scanning. But if you zoom out, these are just step after step. This is why it's diagnosable. There are patterns. So what happens after projection is, let's call it fusion and false bonding. Again, Venus is being hijacked by the fantasy. I'm going to grab a little bit of water. I'll be right back. You know what I was just thinking while getting that water? In Iran, we have this saying, which is saying like, the truth is always straightforward and is so much better. And then the true self has disappeared. Now there's a false self, which is a lie self in some way. We have this expression, it's so much easier to eat your food like this rather than like this. It feels like that's what the narcissist is doing, and then they end up breaking their own arm in someone else's head. But let us continue. So, what happens after the projection? So, the narcissist scans, it found its ideal partner, someone who's shiny, desirable, according to their assessment, worthy. So it's a good possession to have. Now you got to fuse with it. And this is where Venus goes from connecting and merging to completely something else. First thing that the narcissist has to do, it has to collapse the boundaries. This is where the work begins. Remember that object relations, there's no separation between you and the narcissist. And the narcissist has to make sure that you also understand this. So instead of true intimacy, the project of enmeshment begins, which is a kind of a simulated bond, and it feels super intense. It's very consuming and it's very immediate, and the narcissist will be with you everywhere. So you go to get your nails done, you're a female, the narcissist is there. You're a female narcissist, he has gone, I don't know, to the gym. That's where he likes to be on his own spare time. The female narcissist is there. They are just breaking the boundaries, like everything that used to do personally, and it's actually personal, it's for you. They will be there. They will take these kinds of real steps to make sure the boundaries are blurred and they can enmesh. And you know what? This is also the phase that's called love bombing. If you've been looking at narcissism, I'm sure you've heard this expression a million times. So in this phase of the relationship, the narcissist floods the relationship with attraction, praise, declarations of destiny. It will tell you why it was born, which is to be with you. It can imagine you guys have a family and be together forever and ever. It will take scars on your body parts and say these were the impressions of God, which were meant for us to connect. They will even try to be at your service, which is kind of funny because they're looking for service providers. In other words, they just mirror back to you everything that you hope for in life, everything that you wish to experience in life. And this phase, this love bombing phase, feels like magic. Like, how could this be? How could I be with this person? But we have to remember, it's not rooted in mutual recognition. It's merely a strategy of absorption for the narcissist. And if you've ever been in such a relationship, reflect back. There was no real dialogue of union. There were no exchanges of subjectivities. Venus was not bridging two people to be able to establish a connection, to actually become a union, to establish a union. If you think back, it was one person pulling you in. The narcissist was pulling you in into their own curated world. You were just being folded inside the fantasy of the narcissist. You were being loved for how well you fit into the narcissist fantasy and not for who you actually are as a human being. In a lot of ways, this love bombing phase is just a kind of a mimicry of intimacy. Again, go back to the Mercury video because I talk about that chameleon quality of narcissists and the way they mimic your interests and your likes, and they shapeshift. And you know, because this is not a genuine expression of love, there's something very unnatural about the pace of it, the rhythm of it, the emotional cadence of it. Everything just feels off. It's too much. It's like natural bonding has an element of surprise in it. You meet someone you're interested in, you go for a couple of coffee dates, you have dinner together, you spend time, and then there comes a day where you don't see them for 3 days. Their lack of presence, you feel them because you've bonded with them. But with a narcissist, this bonding is very unnatural. It was too intense, it was too fast, and it was too consuming. And one of the things that narcissists do, like right before a relationship is over, they have already started this love bombing phase with another person. Like you broke up on the first of the month. On the second, there was someone else. They have already had someone else. And they're already absorbed into their world. So it's just intense, too fast, too much. A lot of people need like a year or two to process a breakup and then get into something else serious. Not the narcissist, like right there and then there was someone else because it's not real. It's hard to lend your heart to someone else after when you just claim to love someone. The whole thing is just a very odd process that they go through. And this is because the love for the narcissist is not real. It's just idealized. It's not grounded in care and reciprocity. All of it is just driven by fantasy again. And we know real love takes time. Again, that bonding has an element of surprise. So does love. When you fall in love with someone, that feeling suddenly hits you. You're like, I feel connected with this person. And there's a moment you're just taken by that feeling because of the way it comes on. Like real love requires presence, it requires work, it requires accountability, it honors difference. With the narcissist, all of these things are non-factors, they're just not part of the equation. And in this love bombing phase, I was saying they get so enmeshed with you and so over involved. If you reflect back, if you've been in that dynamic, there was no room for your autonomy. There was no room for mutual growth. You were just involved in this crazy story and you were just going. It was taking you. Venus in its healthy form, it helps us meet people on an equal kind of a ground. But here, Venus is starting to actually hijack another person. It's like a kind of a kidnapping almost. And yes, that part of Venus that's about merging is about over time, over a long time, creating one out of two, which means smoothing out the differences between people. But those differences are not completely erased. It's like, puzzle pieces where things fit into each other. A proper Venus will create some distinctions like that because that's what's keeping the puzzle together. But with the narcissist, love, Venus in a narcissist just erases all differences. And this is one of the reasons why you feel erased after when you've been in a relationship with a narcissist for a long time. The partner actually becomes the reflection of a narcissist. They're not a participant in falling in love. It was a script that was written and then it was handed to you and you're just reading it and you're in it. You're in the movie. So now we go to another stage, which is about creating a shared fantasy. So we got Venusian delusions of love. So when we come to the shared fantasy, we could say at the heart of this whole dynamic with the narcissist is this thing that we call a shared fantasy. And here Venus takes center stage in its most deceptive form. The shadow aspect of Venus, completely dysfunctional. In some ways, we could call Venus the planet of enchantment because it draws us in to what's beautiful. It promises love, the hope of union, the need for harmony, peace. These are all Venus's significations. It's enchanting. These are enchanted states of being if we have the pleasure of being in such states. And when these states are healthy, when we are in union and relation to a healthy dynamic, the kind of longing that it generates in us leads us toward greater intimacy. It creates stronger connective tissues. In essence, it's taking us from that longing and fantasy of what love is and how we long for it into something real. With the narcissist, we got the inverse process. Everything's weird, as usual. In the narcissist, Venus becomes a kind of a spell that binds people because the shared fantasy is coming from the delusion of the narcissist. And the narcissist will actually verbalize these kinds of things too, like that delusion and illusion that coming out of the shared fantasy, which is stemming from the false self. It will talk about destiny and soulmates and twin flames. I learned the word in previous videos. I was like, it can even have like a redemptive quality to it. It's all coming from the shared fantasy. Let me see, what's another way of explaining this shared fantasy? It's kind of like the narcissist recruits its partner into a self-delusional story that it has made. So it has to become shared. It has to be something that you also accept. And when you pay attention to what these stories, these delusions of the narcissists are, that they need you to get involved in it and also be in that fantasy, they're usually stories that are very grand. They're sweeping, they're even mythic. They're going to conquer the world and you're going to be Bonnie and Clyde and you're going to be a power couple. They construct these fantastical stories. They can even have that spiritual tone to it, that we're spiritually connected. They can make it sound poetic. They'll make statements like, I don't just love you. We were made for each other. I was made for you. And you got to remember, that's hard for narcissists. They're made for anyone. Everyone's made for them. But to create this shared fantasy, they will say such things. Like, I was born to love you and to protect you. or you're the only one who really sees me. Later on, it will become like I'm the only one who sees you. You'll never find love like me. But to create the shared fantasy, these kinds of statements are very common. And it's important to remember at this point, this whole employment of the shared fantasy and the bonding that it's trying to create is used for a very specific reason. And that's because, as I just said, they need to pull you into the fantasy. And there's another thing. This is where things get very twisted. So they're not creating this fantasy just so that you love them. The architecture of this fantasy is to make you also fall in love with the image of yourself that they're creating for you. In other words, remember I was saying that they come to idealize, but they also need you to idealize yourself. And the way that they do this is through these stories that they construct in the share fantasy phase. These stories are constructed in a way that they want the partner to see themselves as someone who's special, someone who's chosen. If they're a female narcissist, they'll look at the guy and they want you to see yourself as heroic. If you're a woman, they want you to see yourself as super feminine, sexy, seductive. If they have a fetish for strength, they want you to see yourself as someone very strong, disciplined. In essence, they're creating a role for you because that's who you are in that fantasy in their mind. And they're trying to sell you the role and the story that goes along with it. They're giving you a role and you need to buy into it. And this is a very important stage because if you don't buy into the story, if you don't get to fall in love with yourself in this role, the role that they're creating for you and how supposedly you are, because that's what they're selling you, this is where the dynamic with the narcissist ends. But if you buy into it, the game is on. And if you think about it, it's kind of like a psychological trick because a narcissist is creating a narrative where you're extraordinary. And because you feel yourself that way, because you're being perceived that way through the eyes of the narcissist, you will invest even more into the narcissist and into the relationship. But if you pay attention, this is not a shared story. You're not even entering the story as equals. You're merely entering as a character who has a script and gotten the script from the narcissist, and not even from the narcissist, but from the false self of the narcissist. And the script was written before you even arrived, because this is the fantasy of the false self. This is what the false self needs in order to outsurvive itself, which is a mere fantasy. It needs your confirmation in conspiring in this story. And yes, the story was written before you came. So we're not talking about equal partnership or equal co-authorship here, but they will make you feel like you are the co-author of that story, but it's one that they have written. And this is the shared fantasy phase is one of the most potent parts of interacting with a narcissist. It's actually a very powerful trick that they employ. I mean, they have an uncanny ability to pull people into this shared fantasy. And the enchantment of it feels very real. There's a sense of magic in it. You feel like for the first time in your life, you're being recognized, you're being seen. Your voice counts. It can even feel like, oh my God, there's some sort of a cosmic timing to this whole thing. They write that story very well. In some, it emotionally feels real, even though it's not real. But when we think about this, everything about this is ontologically false, because none of it is actually built on truth. The source of it is the false self. And all of it is a form of manipulation. It's built on projection. And it's a means for the narcissist to actually avoid reality, not to be in reality. So Venus becomes a mirage. What looks like mutuality here is actually a form of seduction with Venus. And what feels like destiny is a design. The whole shared fantasy, that stage is a design to pull you into the world of the false self. And you know, it's nice to be seen as someone great, as someone beautiful, as someone handsome, as someone strong. And there's such overemphasis on these qualities in the shared fantasy by the narcissist. Part of the process feels extraordinary. And it's really difficult for the person who's being duped into it to understand that they're merely being casted for someone else's dream. It's hard to make yourself believe in that moment that you're actually not loved. This is not love. It's merely an outline of the narcissist fantasy by the false self. But Houston, we got a problem. Roger that. What's the problem? Fantasies cannot tolerate contradiction. And because the partner of the narcissist is an actual real person, over time, they will begin to show their humanness. They're going to show differences. They're going to demand to have autonomy. Even though the shared fantasy, in that moment, you want to relinquish all of it. Even though on some level, you know you are not the things that they're saying that you are, you give into it. But at some point, it's like, this thing actually doesn't match reality. I can't exist in reality. So you try to show some autonomy. You reveal your human imperfections, and then the spell begins to crack. So now let's see how this cracking of the spell looks like. So when you show that, hey, I'm actually human, I have preferences, what the hell are you talking about? The narcissist will feel you as a threat. So this is the stage of threat detection and testing you. And in this stage, we can see Venus starting to really cool off with all the things that the narcissist was doing that was so hot and heavy. Here, you're going to start to notice the flow of affection is slowing down. When they used to walk by you and give you a kiss, it's been months, nothing. So this is the part where we could call it narcissistic testing. Here, Venus is not representing that kind of a delight that was in the shared fantasy. Here, Venus is starting to act like a gatekeeper of conditional worth. And the narcissist at this point starts testing their partner. The false self begins to ask questions. And we got to remember, the false self is an illusion itself, so all of its questions are quite distorted too. So the false self will be asking, is my partner still playing the right role? Remember, they give you a script. Are they still reflecting the fantasy back to me? And if you think about it, in essence, they're asking, is my partner still a good enough mother who will meet all of my needs, who will even take all of my abuse, and they will never abandon and neglect me? See the first video about the sun and moon, especially the part about the moon, to understand what I'm saying, because this video is already going to be long and I don't want it to be longer. Here, the narcissist needs to understand if you're holding up your end of the bargain. They need to know if you're still committed to the fantasy. And to be committed to the fantasy is to be the good enough mother. So the narcissist will start the next phase. In this phase, they will start to provoke you. They will withdraw. They will apply a lot of emotional pressure. And it's not always harsh, but it's strategic. So they're not going to do something where the whole relationship's going to collapse and fall apart at this point. They're just testing. It's their version of reality testing or fantasy testing. I'm trying not to laugh and be serious because there's a part of me that wants to hold some empathy for the chaos creators because they are made. Even if we say it's nature, then you still don't have control over it. So it's not like they wake up one morning and then they decide that I'm going to act evil and crazy and create chaos and havoc in other people's lives. And we got to understand that they bring those same qualities into their own life. But it's like being in a circus with those fun mirrors. What is it called? The House of Mirrors, where there's just all kinds of distortion. Sometimes it's hard not to like burst out in some sort of inappropriate reaction. So a kind of a fantasy testing, reality testing, whatever we want to call it here, is just a way for the narcissist to scan for threats to this shared fantasy, to its idealization and its fantasy process. What the narcissist essentially wants to know by employing these kinds of tests is to see if you can still be controlled. Will you mirror them back? Will you suppress your needs, your doubts, and your autonomy just to stay in the story that they have handed you? And I want you to notice from here forward, Venus and Mars are co-conspiring. I will talk more about Mars's role in the next video. But as you will see, tinges of Mars are coming through. And another thing in a narcissist chart, the connection of Venus and Mars in a problematic way has to be in a chart. So I explained what we're looking for Sun and Moon, what we're looking for Venus. With Mars, for example, you want Mars in Venus's signs where it's, for example, squaring Venus in a sign where Venus is uncomfortable. We want these planets super uncomfortable so that they're not acting from their optimal and elevated place. Because narcissism is showing us that the person's actually struggling with life in some ways, and they're creating struggles for other people. So, but I will make a video talking about placements, yogas, and things of that nature. We're just trying to understand the archetypes, the symbols, and the disorder itself. So they're checking to see if you're in the story, and then if you show any deviance from this, which could include you having a preference, you showing some differences, you asserting yourself, all of it is going to be a contradiction to the fantasy. After all, you're supposed to be like them. That boundary doesn't exist. You cannot exist as a singular and an autonomous person. That is a threat to the fantasy. So this triggers alarms in the narcissist's mind about your role and the kind of story that you're trying to create. And what happens at this stage, you're going to start to get subtle punishments, for lack of a better word. So these subtle punishments could be in the form of coldness, silence, acting aloof. It can come in the form of mockery, insult, excluding you from different facets of their life, withdraw affection or their presence. You can call this the phases of pseudo breakup. In this stage, a lot of people will break up and go back. And this could last for years, because the relationship can't get to its final collapsing moment where the narcissist can discard you. But to control you and to keep bringing you back to the fantasy because you're a willing participant to keep going back to your role in that story, they'll break up with you. They'll make sure you understand your place in this relationship, and then they'll come back with you. That's why I'm calling it pseudo breakups. And they can last anywhere from hours to even months. And these are also phases where they start talking a lot about their freedom. So they'll ghost you, and then when you're like, what the hell is that about? They'll be like, I need my freedom. You're always in my face and you're always in my way. Or they'll just tell you very hurtful and absurd things. Like they'll take those elements of the shared fantasy that they created, and then they'll make a point to tell you, like, you are not that person. It's like a reverse psychology. So you're trying harder to be that person, which essentially means you're going back to the narrative, to the story that they want you to be, that role that they want you to play in. And you know what? In this initial stage where you're being tested, it's hard to realize what's happening. It just feels like lights are getting dimmer. That euphoric love that you felt at the beginning, where it felt very unconditional, grand, mythical, it's just being dimmed. It just feels like a lot of sharp edges are suddenly starting to poke out and it's poking at you. It's uncomfortable. And in essence, this is Venus being weaponized in the relationship. It's no longer a planet related to devotion. Venus and Moon, all the planets related to the feminine principle can be very devotional. Here, Venus is becoming a symbol of transactional approval, which means you are only loved when you comply. You're cherished only if you stay quiet, which means you're wanted as long as you don't threaten the fantasy. These are the implicit and sometimes explicit messages that comes through in this phase. What they long for is to restore that initial phase, which was actually constructed by the narcissist. So everything's contingent on them, whether if they want to give it to you or to not give it. So people generally try even harder in this stage. They give more. They soften their own edges. They shrink themselves. And all of it in the hopes of getting back what the narcissist had constructed and presented to them at the beginning, which just feels completely out of reach. When this phase starts, there is no going back ever. I mean, who really wants to go back to that? But because you don't have the realization of what had happened, you want to go back. But from this phase forward, there is no going back. And we got to remember, the narcissist didn't just make you fall in love with them by idealizing them. They also made you idealize yourself and in some ways fall in love with yourself. So to have that love dissolved in this point, to have it dim, is not just about the narcissist anymore. It feels like you're losing yourself. And this is one of the reasons I have been saying this in a number of videos too. One of the best things we can do in this world is not to feel flattered by how other people perceive us or what they think of us. Whatever they think, for better or for worse, is their perception. You know, in Iran, we have this very beautiful saying. So if you tell someone, let's say, oh my God, you're absolutely beautiful, the person who receives a compliment is supposed to say, one sees what one is. If you are not immune to flattery and compliments, narcissists have the trump card in their back pocket. And we just have to remember at this point, as painful and as distorting this phase of the relationship is, it's just the beginning. The pain at this phase is kind of like walking and banging your toe against the leg of a table. What's ahead is the pain of it is more like being skin alive. Because when the narcissist feels that that initial spell has cracked and the narcissist starts to feel threatened, we're going to get devaluation, rejection, and the slow erasing of everything until you are discarded. Such a horrible word to say to someone that you've been discarded, but that's what the narcissist will make you feel like. Like you're something disposable that they can just put aside. Normal people, as I was saying earlier, you break up, you need time before you get into another relationship, but how they do things right after, you feel disposable, you know? Like they can just discard. It's a very painful process. And it makes me sad to say this, but the narcissist doesn't just at the end want to discard people. We're going to get to this phase, just a little precursor to it. They don't just want to discard someone. The satisfaction comes from knowing that they have destroyed someone. They need to know that you've been destroyed after they leave. We'll come to this. Now we're getting to the part I was initially saying I dread talking about it. So, hello, Venus and Mars explicitly at this point, at this phase, which is maintenance through control. We're getting Venus as an enforcer now, not as a merger, not as someone or something that establishes union anymore.